All right, so thank you, of course, thank you all to the panelists. Thank you to everyone attending. We really appreciate you spending, whether it's your late evening or your early morning, taking the time to join us for this conversation. So as certainly many in the audience know, One Day Sooner advocates for human challenge studies, whether for COVID-19 or anything else, high impact research. But we want that contribution, we want that risk that people are willing to take on to benefit humanity, to benefit the whole world. And so part of our work has also been engaging with these questions of global equity, especially around COVID-19, because as everybody knows, this distribution has been incredibly unequal. And in order for us to end this pandemic, it really needs to end everywhere. People need to be vaccinated everywhere. So this conversation is going to be a particular version of engaging that question. We've been doing other conversations that have engaged that in different ways. So this time we have 4 panelists who will be able to speak with us about second-generation vaccines in particular, why we need them, and the different projects that folks are working on with that issue, with thinking about or working on those next vaccines that we will need to continue vaccinating the whole world. So of course, the short version of why we need second-generation vaccines is that people are unvaccinated. So we need every strategy we can to accomplish that task of vaccinating the whole world. And I think a couple of the different facets of why we need more vaccines and what we need to do to get those. One of them is this sort of science and technology side. So I know some of the panelists will be speaking to what new vaccines will do that other vaccines don't. These questions of the technologies, the cost, storage, things like that, be addressing some of those concerns and how second-generation vaccines will address those questions. And then some of the other questions that we'll be talking about is what kinds of institutions we need to develop and distribute more vaccines past the first ones. So I know we'll see lots of people all the panelists are from different kinds of institutions, and I think those are all strategic in terms of how they can develop more vaccines and how they can distribute those. So certainly COVAX will be on the tip of everyone's tongue, but I think there's a lot of other issues of what kind of coordination and cooperation and what kinds of organizations can do that work most effectively and can sort of help us generate the vaccines to do so. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the questions that I posed to the panelists was they're all doing this work in various ways. What are the obstacles to doing that? To some extent, why are these the second-generation vaccines? Why weren't they produced first? Whether that's based on institutional location or based on geographic location or based on basic things like funding and research. There's a lot of different reasons that I know you'll all engage with as to where these vaccines are coming from and how that influences the possibilities and the reasons why they have been the second generation rather than the first generation vaccines. So that's sort of one way to set the stage. Each of the panelists will speak to their own expertise, the own projects that they're working on. Hopefully they'll address some of those issues in one way or another, and I'm sure they will also all come up with questions and all have issues that I haven't raised so far. So again, really dynamic set of people from a really dynamic set of organizations, institutions, working on different kinds of projects. So I'm going to introduce the panelists very briefly. They're all incredibly accomplished, and I encourage you to look them up. But I'll just give you a little bit about their affiliations and some of their backgrounds, their academic or other backgrounds. And then once I'm done with that, they'll each have about 10 minutes to speak to the projects they're working on and in the work they're doing, how it speaks to some of these questions that I've posed. And then there'll be Q&A afterwards. So you can throw questions in the chat as we go. You can throw them in once we're done, once the panelists are done. And you can send them either privately to Danny, me, or Zachariah, who will be moderating the Q&A, or you can just throw them there to the public. So you've got a couple of options. So to introduce the panelists, our first speaker will be Dr. Christian Happy. He is a professor of molecular biology and genomics in the Department of Biological Sciences at Redeemers University. He is also the director of the African Center for Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases. Oyeronke Oyebanji is a public health professional and currently works with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, otherwise known as Sepi. She's part of the COVAX Strategic Coordination Office, contributing to global efforts for equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Previously, she was working at the Nigeria CDC before coming to Sepi. Dr. Jerome Kim is the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. He previously worked in HIV vaccine research with the US military HIV research program. He's been listed among the 50 most influential persons in vaccines and serves on scientific advisory groups to private and public organizations, including the WHO and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi is Associate Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics, and co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, all at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. She is calling from Honduras, which is where she grew up. And she's also a member of the National Academy of Science of Honduras there, as well as working at Baylor in the US.
Thank you.
All right, Oya Ronke, you are up next.
Thank you, Mabel. I will share my screen. And hopefully you can see that clearly.
Yep, you're all good.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much to the One Day Sooner team for inviting me to this event. And I wanted to also say how incredibly honored I am to share the stage with my fellow panelists and very esteemed senior colleagues. So thank you again for the honor to talk about the work we do at Sepi. In the next 5 to 10 minutes, I will speak about Sepi's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I will speak very briefly about our vaccine portfolio, but most of what I will focus on today is on our work with COVAX in ensuring equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. So I thought to start with a very brief history of Sepi for those who do not know about us. Sepi is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and we were set up firstly in 2017, really to address, the challenge of having a coordinated international and intergovernmental plan to develop and deploy new vaccines and ensure or enable equitable access to these vaccines. And this was really recognized following the 2014 West African Ebola epidemic, where we had an incredible effect on West African countries, but also on the entire world. And in doing this, Sepi works across various stakeholders, from governments to regulators to philanthropists, civil society, pharmaceutical, and academia, towards our aim of developing and deploying the resources that we need to prevent future epidemics. In addition to COVID-19, Sepi has also invested in the development of vaccines for specific pathogens, as you would see on the screen, for Lassa, Nipah, Chikungunya, Rift Valley, and Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. And in addition to all of these pathogens, we have also invested in, or we are investing in platform technologies as a way of preparing for the next pandemic, so that we are better prepared and so that we can develop vaccines rapidly as needed. Speaking specifically about our response to COVID-19, you may be aware that Sepi is part of COVAX, which is an institution or a mechanism established together with WHO, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and with UNICEF as a key delivery partner. And I will speak about this in a bit more detail later. But our major contribution to COVAX is in vaccine research, development, and manufacturing. And so far, we have established one of the largest vaccine portfolios, which I will show you in a moment. In addition to that, we've also established mechanisms to harmonize the assessment of COVID-19 vaccine data, including through a centralized laboratory network that we have set across the world, and a mechanism to track SARS-CoV-2 variants together with partners at GISAID. And we've put out calls to advance broadly protective coronavirus vaccines as a way of responding now, but also thinking about the future. And this is a slide to show Sepi's current vaccine portfolio for COVID-19 vaccines, and you would see there that are the vaccines which we invested in early, such as the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, has been deployed to several countries across the world, with more in development. And it also speaks to what was shared at the beginning of this conversation around thinking through wave 2 vaccines. And so we do recognize that we cannot depend on a handful of vaccines, but must continue to develop these as possible to ensure and also ensure equitable access to them. I also thought to highlight very quickly that 3 areas of focus for Sepi has been with speed, so that we have the vaccines that we need as soon as possible, and with scale to produce them in the volume that we need to get across the world, and with access to make sure that people have these vaccines irrespective of their countries or their wealth capacity. And so to speak about COVAX and just the general introduction, like I said earlier, Sepi is working very closely with Gavi and WHO as co-leading partners of COVAX to ensure an equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. And our target is to provide 2 billion doses, deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, towards ending the acute phase of the pandemic. And we do recognize that the surge in cases in South Asia has affected COVAX supplies, but we are still very much within target, within reach for our target of 2 billion doses by the end of the year towards early next year. And so far, COVAX has shipped over 99 million COVID vaccines, and we're waiting for our milestone of 100 million while continuing our work. And this is to 133 participating economies as at today. And despite the challenges with supplies, COVAX has shown so far that its operationalization and its setup really works in ensuring that large volume of doses are deployed to countries across the world, small islands, and to places where they are most needed. I mean, it's interesting that we have to emphasize why Kovacs Matter, because there is no doubt that the world desperately needs a mechanism to make sure that people have access to vaccines irrespective of their country of origin, their country of location, or the purchasing power of their countries. And this is what COVAX has aimed to do and why it really matters. Firstly, and as I said earlier, we're working to get 2 billion doses to be delivered across countries by the end of 2021, using a globally fair distribution mechanism to make sure that these doses get to the people that need them the most. We've also developed a diverse and actively managed portfolio of vaccines to increase our chances of success, as I shared earlier. And with this, by creating the portfolio that we have, we've been able to share the risks and benefits of vaccine research and development. And we hope that through COVAX, or our target is that through COVAX, we can end the acute phase of the pandemic and support countries, all countries across the world, to rebuild their livelihoods and economies. My next slide is just going to wrap up briefly on how Sepi is thinking of all of this in the long term. We've learned a lot of lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, including the global unpreparedness, but various gaps in vaccine manufacturing, distribution, equitable access, and what people now call vaccine nationalism. And so in thinking about these various factors, we've put out 3 focus areas for ourselves: to prepare, to transform, and to connect. And in preparing, we want to strengthen our defenses against COVID-19 and the risk of future coronavirus pandemics. But we also want to continue to develop vaccines for the known threats. And I spoke previously about the pathogens that Sepi is working on at the moment. In transforming, we want to produce a library of vaccines and other biological interventions, but we also want to work to compress the vaccine development timelines to 100 days. And we know this is possible. COVID-19 has taught us that this is possible, and we want to push this further. And finally, in connecting, we've recognized the power of strong global collaborations, and we're going a step further to establish global networks for laboratory capacity, assays, and preclinical models. And also importantly, and in what Professor Happy was saying at the beginning of his talk, is to support the efforts of low and middle income countries to take full ownership of their national health security. And Sepi has recently signed an MOU with the African Union as one step we are taking to support this. And so I will stop here and wait for questions, but just to say in summary that we have the urgency of now. And the urgency of now is thinking about how to end the acute phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also how we can start preparing now for the next pandemic, in preventing it, but also in creating the measures that we need to control it when it comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next up is Dr. Jerome Kim.
Thank you, and let's just put this up. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today on what we hope is the next wave of vaccines that will be distributed with equity, have impact, and bring some form of pandemic control. I'm briefly to go through what Ibi has done during COVID-19. In February of last year, we made the decision not to pursue our own vaccine, but to help anybody who asked for assistance in any of the ways that IBI can, whether it's doing epidemiologic studies, looking at burden, for instance, in low and middle income countries, or helping to test vaccines in animals in preclinical studies, or to do animal challenge studies, or to do phase 1, 2, or 3 trials in human populations, or with assistance with regulatory approvals, or with, particularly now, with effectiveness studies, looking to see whether these vaccines are having a real world effect, separate from the efficacy that was demonstrated in phase 3 trials. And you can see the different organizations. I think now there are 14 different companies and institutes that IBI has worked with, and we've done exactly that, supported epidemiology in phase 3 site development in sites in Africa and South and Southeast Asia, preparing them to do phase 3 trials, to engage low and middle income countries in the development of and testing of new COVID-19 vaccines, supporting actual clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines. So far 4 of them: Novio, Genexin, Celid, and Clover. And actually now recently announced SK Bioscience in trials from phase 1 to phase 3. And now in addition, working with Sinopharm to do effectiveness trials, so beyond phase 3 in Africa. Development of international standards with NIBSC and WHO, and finally preclinical support for a large number of companies, including those not only working on vaccines, but on monoclonal antibodies. That would be Celltrion. But when you think about vaccines, and I'm going to now move beyond what IBI does, we have to think about proving the vaccine works, making the vaccine, and then using the vaccine effectively. And I think with 13 vaccines that have shown safety and efficacy so far, really let's focus on making enough of a high quality vaccine and using that vaccine fairly and with equity. And you heard a very beautiful description of COVAX. 190 countries, coordinated by Sepi, Gavi, UNICEF, and WHO. The 92 countries that will receive no-cost vaccine through the COVAX AMC. The pledge to have 2 billion doses of WHO pre-qualified vaccines available by the end of 2021. And actually the percentage of people who can be vaccinated by the doses that COVAX has secured has increased from the original 20% to perhaps 30% of the world's population, enough to vaccinate people at highest risk, the elderly and healthcare workers. But I think we have to look then also at how important COVAX will be. You know, we talk about things being too big to fail. COVAX is too important to fail. It's too important to fail, not only because of its impact on COVID-19 and the pandemic we have with COVID-19, but on the potential for COVAX to be a new concept, a concept that allows access to innovative vaccine technology in the early years of introduction, something we haven't been able to achieve with other vaccines, whether it's pentavalent vaccine, rotavirus vaccine, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, human papillomavirus vaccine, all vaccines created and used in high-income countries that have taken decades to be implemented in low and middle-income countries. But a failure of equity and access will precipitate three crises. First, the humanitarian crisis. And this is modeling done by the Gates Foundation, but without equity in the first 2 billion distribution of the first 2 billion doses, I want to point out that we're at 3 billion doses, global COVID deaths will double and the pandemic will be prolonged. That's the humanitarian crisis. The economic crisis is similar. Without equity, 50% of the global economic cost of the pandemic in 2021 will be borne by high-income countries if they proceed and vaccinate their own populations to the exclusion of others. Now, this is data from the Brookings Institute and the National Board of Economic Review, but now the Office of National Intelligence, which is attached to the White House in the United States, is saying the same thing. Very similar to what the Secretary General of the United Nations said when he said, no one's safe until everyone's safe. Finally, there's the biological crisis. We know that failure to control the pandemic generates mutants, and these mutants have the potential to undermine the efficacy of vaccines. And these three crises are something we hope to avoid if we can distribute and use vaccines equitably. But what's the global scorecard? We need $50 to $70 billion. The return on investment, that $50 to $70 billion will generate $9 trillion by 2025. All these data from the International Monetary Fund. And what's the scorecard to date? 3 billion doses distributed, less than 1% have been used in low-income countries. 85% have been used in high-income and upper-middle-income countries. And you can see the distribution there in data from the New York Times, dated 10 June 2021. So we have 13 vaccines showing short-term efficacy and safety. But what's next for vaccines? The big questions are optimization of dose, schedule, and boosts, and that includes the mix and match that was recently discussed by the group at Oxford. Correlates of protection or lab marker for vaccine efficacy. Really important if we want to get the second wave of vaccines out as quickly as possible. Third, what's the real world evidence around the use of vaccines? We have vaccines with efficacy that ranges from 50% to 95%. But what is the real world effect of these differences in efficacy? And then I think the news is actually good there. The fourth point is that we need surveillance for mutations. You know, the vaccines currently work against the mutants we know about, but there are a lot of mutants out there that we probably don't know about. And surveillance systems around the world need to be strengthened. Sequencing needs to be done on isolates, not only in high-income countries, but in isolates from everywhere, so that we know in advance what the mutants are and what the threats are to our currently developed vaccine solutions. The fourth point is that we need longer-term safety follow-up, and we need to strengthen post-licensure safety systems in countries around the world. There are some countries where 5 or 6 different vaccines are currently in use. We need to know if there are safety signals occurring at the level of 1 in 50,000 or 1 in 100,000 vaccine recipients, and are we ready yet? No. Could this undermine vaccine implementation by creating doubt around the safety of vaccines? Absolutely. So we need to strengthen those systems. And finally, opposition to vaccination. And we're starting to see a dramatic decrease in the rate of vaccination in some countries, with significant portions of the population geographically dispersed occasionally, with very low rates of vaccination, which pose a threat to all of us. This gets to a quick point about doses, and this is the AstraZeneca vaccine. The original report showed that people who got a low dose, followed by a regular dose, had 90% efficacy. People who got 2 standard regular doses had 60% efficacy. Again, getting to the idea that we don't necessarily know. I mean, we have proof that the vaccine is safe and efficacious, but are there ways to improve the performance of the vaccine? Yes, there are. A second point to make, again, from the AstraZeneca data, although other vaccines are similar, and that is originally the vaccine was a single dose. That was then changed to be a 2 doses. And because of the change in the dosing schedule, there were differences in efficacy. And the differences in efficacy are very interesting because as you space the doses apart up to 12 weeks, you see increases in efficacy. So again, getting to the point that it may still be possible to optimize the dose and the schedule of vaccines. And now it looks like we are beginning to see data on improvements in neutralizing antibody titers if we mix and match vaccines. So again, very interesting data coming out of Oxford University and now in preprint form. This is a simple graph of the potential impact on a correlate of protection. So what we've been trying to find in all of these studies, these phase 3 studies of efficacy, is a particular lab signal. Is it neutralizing antibody? Is it binding antibody that appears to correlate with efficacy? And in this case, this is back of the, not a formal correlates analysis, but it looks at the phase 2 immunogenicity using either neutralizing antibody or binding antibody, normalized for the level of neutralizing antibody or binding antibody found in convalescent sera reported in the same study compared to efficacy. And you can see that there's a strong correlation between both of these antibody measures and the efficacy that was seen in phase 3. Very important finding. Let's hope that we have a correlate of protection because this will reduce the size, increase the speed, and potentially allow us to do some of the very important work on doses and schedules without actually having to do phase 3 trials involving 30 to 60,000 people. Now, this is the table that I've generated on my own. So it's based on data that are available and that are published. And you can see the different vaccines on the left side. On the top, you see different countries where large-scale vaccinations have been done. And you can see that despite having dramatic differences in efficacy in phase 3, now remember, efficacy looks at the protection of individuals. When you look at effectiveness in different countries around the world, we're seeing pretty much between 80 and 95% effectiveness in reducing severe illness, hospitalization, and death. So again, really important data that continues to come out and important questions that are being raised in some of the breakthrough infections in countries around the world. The impact on variants, and I think the good news is that right now, and actually there's effectiveness data, there's actually neutralizing antibody data, and there's actually data in phase 3 trials with Novavax and Johnson & Johnson vaccines that there is protection against of the variants that we know of so far. Are there variants out there that we may not know of that could undermine the effectiveness? $20 billion investment in vaccines, potentially, and that's why we need to do surveillance. These are the first wave, the wave 1A, which are the vaccines where we're expecting data shortly, before the middle to end of the year, and then wave 2, which are the later wave vaccines. And of course, I pointed out before that IBI is working on several of these vaccines, assisting companies in the performance of phase 3 efficacy trials. So again, prove it, make it, use it, and then value it. We have the wave 1, wave 1A, and wave 2 vaccines. But really, we are stuck a bit in that there have been delays in production, as one might anticipate, as we go from low rate to high rate production. Using it, again, supply is one question, use of it is another, but really implementation is what will finally bring closure to the pandemic. So some quick questions for the future. 13 vaccines, how do we know which to use? What's good enough? Will we need multivalent vaccines that cover variants? And hopefully access will be improved with vaccines against these variants. Will COVAX be able to deliver on the 30% of vaccine promised in 2021? But where does the other 70% come from? If we really want to achieve herd immunity levels in global populations by the end of the middle to end of 2022, can the world actually deliver 16 billion doses of vaccine once they're made? Remember that we can vaccinate 80 to 85% of children around the world with EPI vaccines. And just take the example of Korea, the annual birth cohort, which is the group that receives pediatric vaccination, is 300,000. The population of Korea is 51 million. Can we do the same scale up of vaccination programs around the world that will allow us to deliver those vaccines and have the true effect that we need? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And next up is Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Christian and Ronke and Jerome for this great presentation, and Mabel for inviting me. I think I'm also going to share my screen, but I have it disabled. And sorry if I didn't realize I was going to end up presenting some slides.
It looks like Danny just set you as a co-host.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So well, first, again, thanks for the opportunity. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a history of who we are, the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. As you said, we are an academic health sciences university-based vaccine development center. I co-direct the center alongside Dr. Peter Hotes, and we also have a bunch of other additional hats. As you can see, we're deans, associate deans, we run a school, we also run a department. But I think what I wanted to leave at the end of this is, after I tell you a little bit my story and our role and contribution, certainly in the COVID-19 pandemic, is the importance of academic-based research and development activities that now it's shaping more and more in having a huge role in this ecosystem of bringing new discoveries and really translating them into suitable products that can then be used and developed by partners, like, for example, partners like IVI, or partnering with organizations that fund, like Sepi, and working directly in activities pertaining to technology transfer, sending, of course, prototype of products, in this case, vaccines, or at the same time contributing to the evaluation of such products in their critical path activities, such as, scale up and even clinical trial and clinical development. So I wanted to give you a little bit of the history. So the concept of our vaccine center, actually, we're entering now our third decade of being in operation. And we really were created back in the early 2000s. And we were initially branded as the Sabin Vaccine Institute product development partnership. And really it stemmed from an initial fund that we received from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And as you remember, back in the early 2000s, this concept of PDPs, product development partnerships, especially to advance R&D for malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, the neglected tropical diseases, was really where this concept arose. And so we, similar to also IVI and maybe, DNDi for drugs and PATH, and many other PDPs, we were established, again, to work in partnerships and try to move products against, these very important infectious tropical emerging diseases, to the point where we could start seeing them entering into the, evaluation and eventually leading to licensed products. So again, we were established back in 2000, but in 2011, we actually got recruited to the Houston area with a partnership between Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine. And interestingly, here you can see how having a backing from a pediatric hospital together with an academic institution also leverage, of course, having not only resources that are given to us by our institutions, where the agreement is, as you know, in an academic system, what we do is we apply for research funds, but for every extramural fund that we bring in, our institutions also match or contribute. And so there is this, of course, very nice system where we can diversify a little bit our portfolio, but also allows us not only to get funding from extramural sources, but having the institutional support that sometimes is required to fill the gaps. For example, when we don't have funding that usually it's sustainable in certain cases. And I'll give you the exact example with COVID-19 and even coronavirus research, where indeed, our institutions filled some of these gaps while, SARS and MERS were not really of interest, and that allowed us to continue the work prior to, of course, the COVID-19 situation. So as I mentioned to you, the way that we were created for the last 20 years was initially with a very strong focus of developing interventions and vaccines for the neglected tropical diseases. As you know, by WHO, there's at least 17 of these tropical diseases, but also we started getting an interest in what we call the emerging infectious diseases, which now again, as you know, WHO categorizes them around 20 of them. And I think all of them in general have a very similar, distribution, very prevalent also in populations of poor living, not only in low middle income countries, but also in poor populations in high income countries. Most of these diseases are also not new, they're ancient. And one uniqueness is that in addition to some of them being, of course, of high mortality, most of them are also chronic, disabling. And one of the things that, of course, we have always been interested is in doing work that also ensures that it touches the One Health ecosystem. So it's not only the human disease, but it's also what do we know about the vectors, what do we know about the transmission, what do we know, of course, about even the ecosystem of One Health. And that's where, at the end of the day, our mission, it's a threefold mission in our vaccine center. We are, of course, developing and testing new low-cost and effective vaccines against, many of these emerging and neglected tropical diseases. But we do it also with an objective for us to ensure that every technology or every platform or every disease that we want to focus really also helps build and helps strengthen the capacity of doing such vaccine development, not only locally, but also with foreign nations. And I think, again, with the great example of the coronavirus research that we've been doing, we can show you now that it really ensured the little bit of the easiness of technology transfer, our technology to, of course, other nations. And at the same time, we also try to raise awareness of these diseases and certainly do work that guides policy and advocacy. Very briefly, the portfolio that we have had since certainly 2011, but started back in the year 2000s. We have now at least a half a dozen vaccine programs. We have, in fact, 2 neglected disease vaccines, one for human hookworm infection and one for intestinal schistosomiasis, that in fact are quite advanced. They are currently in phase 2 clinical trials, and we do these clinical trials partnering with organizations in Africa. For example, Schisto is being tested right now in Uganda. We have done various clinical trials for hookworm in Gabon. We also work in Latin America. We have a huge program with Brazil. For Chagas disease, for example, we right now are going to be launching a manufacturing campaign, technology transfer our vaccine candidate to a company in Mexico, and we're planning to do a phase 1 clinical trial within Latin America. I'll tell you a little bit, of course, of what we've been doing on coronavirus, but as you can see, we try to fill again this gap of not only looking for discoveries, but also fashioning them and transitioning them in a way that we can transfer them and deploy them and evaluate them in the low middle income country setting. So talking a little bit about how did we prepare for coronavirus vaccine, one thing that also, as many other groups, we already had been working on coronavirus vaccine research even back from 2011. We actually received a grant from our National Institute of Health in the United States when SARS and MERS were still, a relatively high priority. We created, again, what we call a partnership that involved many institutions, including, for example, the New York Blood Center in New York that had a receptor binding domain against SARS and MERS that were quite promising. We then worked with the University of Texas Medical Branch that had all the animal models for evaluating the vaccine candidates. We, in our labs, of course, we created the prototypes, producing them, and I'll tell you a little bit about our vaccine technology. And we actually led to the point where we worked with the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, especially their pilot biomanufacturing facility, where we therefore technology transfer the prototypes where they produce GMP clinical grade material. But then, of course, after 2016, when we actually had a manufactured SARS vaccine, there was zero priority, and we were never able to transition these prototypes into clinical development. But the learnings and the information we knew about the candidates and how we were going to be able to create these prototypes were really very enabling. And again, through funds from our institution, we maintained the program alive. And when 2019, 2020 came, we very rapidly were able to create prototypes that, I'll tell you now where we're at. And therefore, in 2020, we even expanded even more our partnership, where we invited groups such as PATH, for example, that helped us ensure regulatory enabling portfolio of documentation in the preclinical arena, and then also working with groups like Infectious Disease Research Institute, where we were looking at formulation science. We were able to then transition a COVID-19 for technology transfer. So before I tell you how we did the actual transfer, just a word on the type of technology. And I think Jerome really highlighted very nicely that, and certainly also Ronke with the Sepi portfolio, we used conventional technology, recombinant protein subunit platform technologies. In our case, we use primarily yeast expression systems, but we also use other microbial systems. And these are well established. They're also considered safe because they've also been used previously in other vaccines. In our case, we mirror our production processes very similar to the hepatitis B production system, which is again in a yeast expression platform. We know that there also have our technology is very suitable for pediatric populations. And we also already knew who are the global manufacturers that could have ease in receiving such technology, because anyone who were able to produce hepatitis B vaccine, anyone who has capacity of microbial fermentation technology would be able to adopt this technology. And certainly also we rely on the fact that we understood a little bit more the stability of the products and also the suitability of the cold chain. And we also understood how to start doing what we call formulation science to pair them with the appropriate adjuvant systems. And of course, also knowing that we had already an understanding of the costs and the affordability of these vaccines. So therefore, we, very rapidly were very fortunate that, we entered into the landscape of the COVID-19 vaccines. We established a collaboration with Biological E, an India-based manufacturer. Together, Biological E also partnered with Dynavax. So as you can see, the ecosystem is the Baylor, Texas Children prototype vaccine candidate, which is a receptor binding domain recombinant protein subunit vaccine, was technology transferred to Biological E, who of course knew how to scale it, produce it in large quantities as a protein. And they therefore then did a formulation that paired it with an aluminum-based formulation together with a CpG from Dynavax. And right now, the company is already in phase 3 clinical trials in India. And so therefore, this is the landscape, right? So we, in our laboratories, an academic-based product development partnership laboratory was able to design the seed bank, the cell bank, based on, of course, a receptor binding domain. We did a lot of the preclinical studies to show, of course, the not only quality, immunogenicity, antigenicity of such formulation. We transferred a process. Usually in our laboratories, we can do up to 10 to 20 liter scale-up process development. The company Biological E now has even scaled up even further to be able to produce up to 1.2 billion doses of the protein. Of course, because of some of the issues with access to supply, including access to the Dynavax CPG, right now they can have a formulation capacity of 300 million doses per year. We already heard that the government of India already pre-advanced committed purchase of the initial 300 million doses that Biological E most likely will be able to produce and provide, at least initially, as soon as they, of course, complete their phase 3 trial in India, which is ongoing right now. There is already work, as I think Ronke mentioned, with Sepi, that they are working on advancing a global phase 3 trial, where eventually we'll potentially seek the global emergency authorization. Biological is well versed in working with WHO for pre-qualification. And so the intent is that the company will have an approval in this summer for, of course, deploying the vaccine in India, and then very rapidly between the summer and the fall, get approval so that it can also enter this ecosystem of the need for the global use and distribution. So I think I'm going to stop there, just again summarizing again. There is a very urgent need to fill more, not only products that need to be rapidly scaled up, ideally with simple engineering strategies. We believe that recombinant protein technologies fill that gap. We also know that they're probably going to be one of the lowest cost and with a workforce of production process that may potentially even provide limitless capacity, especially the protein side of production. The technologies are relatively easy to transfer. So we're also working with other companies now to do the same exercise as we did with Biological E. There is already a very well-established quality control release stability indicating assays, and certainly also working with the Sepi validated labs. The company have access to being able to do, of course, all the needed testing, especially through the clinical trial, and eventually establish the efficacy, and eventually doing also the effectiveness evaluation. We already know very much the stability profiles, even from our experience from these proteins from the SARS and MERS experience. They're regulatory friendly, because we already know how to, we understand the recombinant protein regulatory framework. And we think that, based also on some origin now data from certainly not only Novavax, but even Clover and others, in our the experience of BioE with the phase 1/2 trial, that they are very highly immunogenic, very efficacious, very safe. And we now also know that they are also going to be quite cross-protective against, again, all the variants of concern that we know currently today. So I am going to stop there and stop sharing and sending it back to you all.
Great, thank you so much. So our last panelist is Dr. Christian Happy. Hopefully his internet is working a little bit better. And then just a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, and we'll get to those after Christian Happy's presentation.
All right, thank you, Mabel. And then I really want to congratulate Ronke and then Jerome and Maria, for this great and fantastic talks, and then putting all of us into context. I think they've said it almost pretty all. They've really elucidated what the landscape is. They've really gone from, from the Sepi perspective, that is basically just using a platform in order to encourage vaccine innovation and accelerate vaccine development, to setting up platforms, and then using Jerome platform IVI to demonstrate how one can actually use, vaccine development to, and then move vaccine development forward in order to protect the global community, to Maria, who, elegantly explain how you can use an academic platform toward, developing countermeasures against, diseases. So, I mean, from my own part, I'm probably going to be presenting from the African perspective here, and it's related to COVID, but not strictly to COVID, but also having a look forward. I don't have a slide to present, but I'll basically just go on and then tell you exactly how we view this. And I will start by saying that, COVID as a disease has come in and then showed the world how weak we are and how unprepared we are when it comes to, pandemic preparedness or pandemic response. And as such, it is imperative and very urgent that not only the global north, but also that the global community and the international community, prepare better, against the next pandemic and against disease X, as we used to say, while I was in Sepi advisory board. Now, how do we do it? If we're talking about that context, then you can see how, COVID is actually a clear demonstration how we're so far behind this pathogen and these viruses, even though we claim we have the technologies, but we still have many hurdles to get over. Now you can see, how science and technology has accelerated, vaccine development. Within a year of COVID, we went from a disease that we don't know anything about, a very new virus, and develop a countermeasure, and then having vaccines, and then push vaccines out there, and then use vaccines to save lives. But unfortunately, greater as it was, like, what Ronke presented, COVAX, great initiative, great thought behind it, and then thinking about vaccine equity, which is absolutely what we were supporting where I was in Sepi. But then we meet a major roadblock. And what is that major roadblock? It is that the truth is that when the tips are down, countries would naturally want to protect themselves. And this is exactly what is a limiting factor, for COVAX. That's one major limiting factor for COVAX. Now, and as such, where do we put Africa and then other developing countries in this whole process? This has to do with, first of all, setting up a framework, and setting up a framework such that, and making people understand that within that framework, in a world that is a global community, as long as vulnerable countries are not protected, nobody in the global north or in the global west should think that they are protected. And as such, it is important to start thinking about setting up and developing the platforms that are needed all over the world in order to promote, science development, and especially vaccine development, not only for COVID, but setting up platforms that will protect, that will prepare, countries like Africa against not only COVID, but also the next and in the future pandemics. How do we do that? Again, by developing science, leveraging, academic institutions, just like Maria presented an example, and then also setting up organizations just like IBI, set up on the continent. Yes, COVID has presented the weaknesses, but then we're also seeing some shift, from organizations like Sepi, through Kovacs, signing agreements in order to develop platforms in Africa. But then the question here is, when we have all those agreements and then those initiatives or those MOUs signed, there is a huge gap between signing those MOUs and then real implementation. The question often is, where are the resources coming from? Who bear the cost? So these are very important and very tangible questions that, we all have to think as a global community, look at the global community and then find answers for. As far as Africa is concerned, we will be thinking that Africa is so far off in order to actually develop vaccines. But then if there's anything to provide, is the fact that COVID also showed that, Africa wasn't that far off. If you look at surveillance, for instance, Africa is really much on top. We look at genomic surveillance, not by numbers, but also by the activities and the very coordination that is existing in Africa in order to identify variants. You could see that happening very quickly in Africa. And then these really are very important in terms of, sitting down and then thinking about how do we set up a system to help a country like Africa. Now, the question is also that, while Africa is lagging behind, and then they could have made investment or the attempt of investment that they are making today, they could have done it yesterday. Then moving forward is, as a continent, what do we do? And then partnering with the global community. Can we, as Africans, set up a very efficient surveillance system in order not to respond to one of the questions that Jerome mentioned, to look at variant and emerging and then how they're evolving. in order to think about developing the next generation vaccine? The answer is yes. There is a very strong network of surveillance in Africa, supported or driven by the Africa CDC. And then you could see many African countries, identifying variants early, both variants of concern or variants under investigation or variants of interest very quickly. Now, the point is with that, if we have if you already have those platforms established, so what do Africa need in order to go to the next level? I do think that Africa has to tap in its diaspora, and Africa has to tap in the local academic institutions and then the scientists available on the continent in order to leverage the skills, the knowledge, and the expertise that are available in order to actually start thinking about developing their own vaccine. Because if anything is to go by, Africa has to learn through this pandemic that they have to be self-reliant, and then they should stop depending from the outside. Now, in order to as I was saying, it's very disheartening that on the continent of 1.3 billion people, there is no single manufacturing platform that we can boast of that can say that can produce vaccine. Is it simply because the facilities are not available? The answer is yes. Is it because also we can say that the brains are not available or the expertise are not available to develop a vaccine within the continent? The answer is no. So I think it is clear that between the Africans within the continent and those in the diaspora, they could actually come together and then set up teams that can actually help to actually develop those vaccines. If you look at all the vaccines that are out there, be it AstraZeneca, be it Moderna, Pfizer, and everything, if you check very well, there are some great African brains behind, all in the teams that are developing these vaccines. So which means that clearly Africa should be able to come up on its own stand and then think about how they want to promote, develop, set up the necessary platform, not only for COVID vaccine, but actually prepare, against future pandemics. So, and in this saying, I would suggest, and my take will be that, as we preparing and then thinking about moving forward from COVID, I do believe that the center of gravity actually for funding and then for support, for against the future pandemic should shift a little bit, from where it is now to Africa. Simply because Africa, if you look at the map of the world, Africa has the highest burden of the viruses or pathogens that present, a pandemic potential. And then, and apart from that, there's just natural condition and many other conditions that actually make Africa, what I call, more or less that make Africa, because of its biodiversity, make Africa more a setup whereby the probability of emergence of these viruses or of the future pandemic may be residing. So I want to submit that at this point, I would suggest that I think we need to start thinking about investing greatly, not only into investing human resources, but also building the necessary capacity, in Africa, so that at least there could be existing a few poles of excellence, be it regional. A few regional poles of excellence in Africa that could actually leverage the skills and the technologies that are available today in order to produce, vaccines for Africa and for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think these were all really great presentations that complemented each other really nicely. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Zachariah Kavuko, who will be handling the Q&A for the remaining 25 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mabel, and thank you so much to other panelists. Those were very wonderful presentations. And maybe just to set us off, just a general question for everybody. I know that in your presentations, almost everybody did indicate about the COVAX facility. Now, when you're talking about global vaccine equity, I think we cannot leave out the COVAX initiative, because so far it's the only framework that has actually made deliberate effort to get vaccines to everyone. And of course, we have a lot of discussion on that, but just a general question to everybody. Do we think the COVAX facility has worked according to plan? Anyone can pick it up.
Well, maybe I can go first if anybody can pick up. I would say that the COVAX initiative as an initiative and then the way it's laid out was really great. Great idea, great stuff. thinking about equity, I think that was really thought out and then thought out clearly. But unfortunately, I keep saying, why we do have that, then, I mean, the framework, I don't think that the framework is there. What is it that, what is the framework to go after what I call delinquent countries, for instance, those that flaunt the rules and those that decide, to flaunt the rules of equity in order to actually, stock up vaccine for their own people. And it's unfortunate because the same people that bring the resources, the same people that support COVAX, the same people that are supporting, that all sign up are the same people that actually decided to break the rule. So I think as long as we keep having these initiatives like COVAX, and then there's really no way to enforce the rules against delinquent countries, then I don't think that we'll achieve what we want to achieve. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Happy.
Maybe I can.
Yes,
I think that Dr. Happy is correct in saying that COVAX is a really important effort, and I'll just put it in perspective. And I use this example frequently, so if you've heard this before, I apologize. But we approved the vaccine against rotavirus in 2006 in the USA. The FDA approved it. In 2009, WHO approved it and recommended its use. In 2021 now, so that's 15 years after FDA approval, 60% of the world's children do not receive 3 doses of rotavirus vaccine. You can look back to pentavalent vaccine. The same lag in implementation exists, decades between the time a vaccine is developed and approved and used in the global north or in high-income countries and the time it makes it out to low and middle income countries. COVAX attempts to overthrow this. And really the fact that they've distributed 133 million doses is a remarkable development for the world. Remember that the other, before COVID, we made 400 to 500 million doses of flu vaccine. COVAX has already distributed 133 million on its way, hopefully, to a target of 2 billion to 3 billion. We want them to be successful. We know that there are going to be delays in scaling up manufacturing, and those problems existed for everyone. It was really important for COVAX to show that it could do what it said it wanted to do. And yes, there have been some delays. Some of the delays occurred because the process of getting vaccines into the mechanism takes time. It took not only approval by a national regulatory authority, but approval by WHO to enter the COVAX mechanism. So again, there were some vaccines, like vaccines from China and now vaccines from Russia, that have been delayed from the point that they were approved by their national regulatory authorities. So there are ways that we're going to have to make this more efficient. And I think that one of the things that everyone should commit to is the idea that this worked, that it's very important mechanism for getting vaccine technology out there, but there are going to be ways to improve it. And the thing to do is to start thinking about these questions about vaccine nationalism. India, we were depending on India to supply a large number of doses to COVAX. The outbreak in India has been so profound and has such dramatic implications for the South Asian region, and the detection of the Delta mutant in other countries around the world really illustrates how important gaining rapid control over the largest outbreaks are, and the importance of surveillance and understanding where the priorities need to be. So again, we need to start talking about this and how we prioritize globally as opposed to nationally. But these are things and questions that we might have anticipated, but we wouldn't be able to deal with until they were actually upon us. So, and I don't want to just be in a position of defending COVAX and saying everything is fine. We need a lot more vaccine out there as quickly as possible, and I'm hoping that COVAX will step up.
Maybe I can just add additional few words, and I think I agree totally, right? The mechanism, it's ideal, but of course, I don't think anyone really was expecting that this pandemic was going to become in such enormous proportions, right? I think the blueprint of the original intent of how COVAX was designed, including the question that I think Jerome asked, was COVAX is going to support 20% of the initial need, but then what's going to happen with the remaining 60, 70, 80%? So I think that as it's an evolving pandemic, and I think the evolvement of the pandemic was so fast, compared to some of the delays of, contractual money, supplies, availability of platforms. And again, this of course already highlights again that it wasn't enough just to rely on novel technologies, that we needed to probably bring conventional technologies a little bit earlier in the game. It also highlights the inequity also in who produces these vaccines regionally. Like I think Dr. Happy mentioned, there's a big gap of just manufacturing capacity in Africa. There's a huge gap of manufacturing capacity in Latin America. There's only a few areas where they could, albeit already ramping up, but they can't support the production of so many billions of doses rapidly with just the ecosystem we have right now. So I think we need to now look at where did it work really well, where were the gaps, what can be done to now sustainably fill those gaps in anticipation, of course, of having another pandemic of these proportions. Because of course, depending on how good we can manage such an epidemic or an outbreak early can depend on how much we're going to need in the future too.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ronke, you have anything to add?
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. I guess I take the last stab at this very interesting question. And I agree with what the panelists have said. And does COVAX work? I will say yes, and I will say yes very boldly, because if you think about it, we have deployed millions, hundreds of millions of doses to over 100 countries. It took about 145 days during the H1N1 pandemic for the first vaccine dose to get to an African country. And with COVID-19, it took only about 78 days. Maybe not only, and yes, that is not ideal, but COVAX has led to a very remarkable difference in the time it has taken to get vaccines to low and middle income countries, and in protecting them from what we will normally address as vaccine nationalism. But yes, there are challenges with COVAX, as the previous panelists have said, and I do not want to re-emphasize those challenges. But what we are thinking of now and pushing for is how can rich countries who have taken up space on the manufacturing supply chain let that space go, since they have enough volume of supplies, so that low and middle income countries can get them and COVAX can meet its goal of equitable access. I mean, COVAX has delivered to remote settings, conflict settings, and is leading a really large global deployment of vaccines in very difficult circumstances. So there are challenges, but it is working towards meeting this goal of equitable access. And there is a lot to think about in the future as well. And I speak as a Nigerian and African, definitely we do need more vaccine manufacturing capacity that is equitably spread, so that we're not depending on one country or on one region for vaccines for future pandemics.
Thank you so much. And maybe before I continue, there's a question that Neo put in the Q&A, and this one is going to Oyeronke. And the question says that your talk was very good. And then the question asks that you elaborate on COVAX allegedly, fair principles for distribution. The background being that last summer there was critique that COVAX distributes vaccines proportionately to the number of citizens instead of proportionate to the public health need. So they seek, I guess, an elaboration from that.
Thank you, Nair, for your kind words. And I think that's a really great question. At this time last summer, there were countries that, had supposedly controlled the pandemic, and we thought they were done with it. And today they have an increasing number of cases. And that is just to show that the entire world faces a huge risk with the pandemic. And it's not with one place or one region. And what COVAX has tried to do is maximize the public health benefits by ensuring that countries signed up to COVAX have at least 20% of vaccines they need to protect their doses as a first step. The next phase of our allocation framework, which is published on the WHO website, and I'm happy to share the link with you, is now looking through the public health challenges that countries face and meeting the needs according to that. But really, this was recognizing that the pandemic is an ubiquitous problem that covers all countries, and so we were trying to make sure that countries were put on the same level in terms of protecting their populations rather than the public health challenge. And I'd also like to say, I think the best time that we get vaccines, or the best effectiveness of vaccines, is to prevent. And so getting doses to countries before they have large outbreaks or before they have surging cases is even more important than getting into them after or during a surge in cases. And this is what the first phase of the allocation has tried to do, to make sure we maximize the public health benefit, and in the next phase start looking through the risks that countries or regions face accordingly.
Thank you so much for the response. And the next one goes to Dr. Kim. It says that you mentioned opposition to vaccines as being a potential issue for the future. How significant a problem do you see this being, or what are the reasons for hesitancy being different in high-income countries as compared to low-income countries? Dr. Kim?
Thank you. And actually, Dr. Patazzi and I have written an editorial with Dr. Hotes on this question of hesitancy. But I hasten to point out that the WHO identified vaccine hesitancy as a major problem in global health a year ago, or actually now more than a year ago, a year and a half ago. So this isn't a new question. And we've seen vaccine hesitancy movements in countries low, middle, and high income. A good colleague of mine in Ghana was the victim of one of these attacks and actually was taken in and questioned by the equivalent of the FBI for work on a potential Ebola vaccine. So I think we have to be aware that modern technology gives the vaccine hesitancy movement a tremendous potential to act anywhere. And the WHO approach, which is to make the vaccines easy to get, make the vaccines a positive, put positive socializing factors around the use of vaccine, and then finally get the vaccine to the point where everyone wants to receive it, I think is really an approach that is important. But I think the other thing that we have to realize is that as scientists, we need to be better and more persuasive about getting people to use vaccine. I think it's been said in the US that American parents give their children, 80% of American parents give their children 26 or 27 different injections for 14 different diseases they have never seen. That's important because it gets to the level of trust that we have in the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Hopefully, if we were able, as was said before, to vaccinate everyone before COVID-19 hits a population, they won't ever see it either. And that would be a wonderful thing. But we really do need to be aware that there are groups out there that are spreading misinformation and that are encouraging, and this is happening in the US, it's happening in other countries around the world as well, where vaccination has been politicized and where the science has been politicized. And when that happens, we sometimes have extraordinary difficulty convincing people that vaccination is right because of the science, is right because of the impact on society, and is right because if we want to fight back against the virus, we keep new mutants from being generated. And the way to do that is to vaccinate everybody as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. Now, in the conversation, I think all of you, again, you touched a little bit about, the need for pandemic preparedness. Now, I'm mentioning this from the framework of equity. If we imagine a world where there is no COVAX, if a world didn't have COVAX, what would global access to vaccines look like right now? And that's the question I would like you to think about. But more to the point, what do you see as the role of low and medium-income countries in terms of the generation or development of second-gen vaccines as we are heading towards equity? Because on the one hand, you've got vaccine nationalism, and definitely this has already been proven that the wealthy countries that are controlling the means of production for this current crop of vaccines that are authorized are prioritizing their populations. So what should be the role of these low and middle-income countries that seem to have restricted access if we're going to acquire equity in terms of vaccine access? Perhaps I would be very interested to hear comments from Dr. Kim first, then Dr. Mariah, and then Dr. Happy and Aaron to follow through.
Okay, all right, I'll take a stab. So I think that, you know, middle-income countries now, and it's difficult to think about it this way sometimes, but think about the BRICS, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. When you look at vaccine manufacturing capacity globally, and when you look at where the vaccines that we're using in COVAX or that people are using around the world, I mean, China and India are major producers. Russia has a vaccine that is safe and efficacious. So you don't have to be a high-income country to generate vaccines. What you do need is the scientific infrastructure, and that was mentioned by Dr. Happy. But you also need the manufacturing infrastructure. And just one thing, I think, you know, IVI has spent a lot of time doing technology transfers of vaccine technology to developing country vaccine manufacturers. So it's something that we do. It's something that Professor Batazzi does in her work as well. It's important that when we start thinking about this, 207 countries can't have individual vaccine manufacturing efforts. So there need to be regional efforts that are formed by groups of countries that are interested in vaccine security. And there have to be agreements that are in place that allow that regional manufacturing capacity to be used for the good of all, and not necessarily just in the country that where the manufacturing capacity is cited. The final part of this is, and this is going to be a more difficult thing because it's economic and financial, but you know, we can get a vaccine for under $1 from a lot of the Indian manufacturers. How is an African or a Latin American and smaller manufacturer going to compete? So as we set up regional manufacturing capability, we have to figure out a mechanism to make these sustainable. If everything is going to go through, for instance, in Latin America, through the Pan American Health Organization's revolving fund for the purchase of vaccines, there needs to be some provision made for the purchase of vaccine from the manufacturing facilities in Latin America. Otherwise, those facilities won't be used, and we won't be prepared for the next pandemic. So again, we need not only to think about siting of manufacturing, but also sustainability of manufacturing.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I can add also on top of what Jerome just mentioned, that as indeed we agree in building these hubs in the different regions, and I totally agree with Jerome that you have to be careful also when you build these hubs, how you're going to be able to sustain them. And usually the easiest part of everything, and we've seen it in many examples where the brick and mortar building the buildings, it's probably easy. But the most difficult part is what are you going to fill those buildings with regards to the workforce? And I think that's the most difficult part of enhancing and creating this larger ecosystem in vaccine development is the expertise that you need of the people who eventually are going to run these facilities. And that's why it's important to build a workforce and then maintain that development of that workforce, you know, with new innovations, with learning, with keeping them abreast of not only the scientific knowledge, but also the quality, right? I mean, remember, you have to have very strict quality, very strict systems of documentation. And I think that's where we, for example, even our center itself, when we decided that we will get into this space of pseudobiotechnology, right? Even though we're embedded in an academic system, you know, how did we, our scientists, just change that mindset of the correct documentation practices, following the right, with the spirit of regulatory enabling, right? With the spirit of the quality systems. And how do we maintain a training program, you know, some sort of warm base? And then how do you transfer that technology to individuals in, you know, other locations that also are abreast of the scientific, you know, capacity? I think that's what it's missing. You can build a lot of buildings, but if you don't have people that can operate those, you know, factories, you know, it's gonna not be sustainable. And I think that's where academics also should have a huge role, right? To maintaining the education of the next generation, not only of scientists, but eventually operators of these facilities and the leaders of these facilities.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that, you know, Jerome and Maria really said it all. And I just want to add one more point. I think I will again speak always from the lens of, from the African perspective. I think it's very important and very critical at this stage that Africa learns to invest where its mouth is. As a continent, we need to learn to invest. And then as there are several models out there. I don't think Africa needs up to 10 vaccine manufacturing plants. I think we probably need maybe 5 or 6 in different, located in different countries with very strong agreement that we will not end up in a situation whereby in case of an outbreak, countries produce where the vaccine manufacturing plant is produced, that they produce just for themselves first. And it is also very important, as you mentioned, that, you know, as we set up these factories, that they got to be filled up, and that's where the academia coming to it. But then, even as a starting point, I think we do have what it takes as a continent, you know, to even start if the right investment is made, and if the right resources are put in place. Now, really, this leaves us in this situation whereby I'm saying, you know, if there's anything to learn from. Now, talking about the next generation vaccine, we have a unique opportunity as Africa. Right now, we can see the variants emerging. And then there is one thing, if care is not taken, Africa might become that epicenter. And if Africa becomes that epicenter, then there is a probability that you may have to see, variants that nobody imagined, and that will be potential threats to the existing vaccines. So what do we do as a continent, you know, to prevent that from happening? Can we as a continent now harness, you know, the skill, the knowledge, and the technology using platforms like IBI to transfer those technologies, using, you know, Africans in the diaspora and in the continent to really accelerate the pace at which we can definitely, you know, start thinking about generating, you know, not the present vaccine, but think about how we can leverage the knowledge and then look at the emergence of this new variant to actually contribute to this pandemic by creating, you know, vaccines that could be probably more responsive, you know, to what may be coming into the future. Over.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I don't know if Renke have anything to add from the perspective of Sepi, but then I just wanted to maybe push in just a slight thought as we are running out of time. You mentioned that, Dr. Jerome mentioned that we have about more than 13 vaccines that are in different stages of development. Now, with the, you know, vaccination rates in the Western countries being so high right now, what is the, I don't know, the probability of having, you know, massive phase 3 trials for these candidate vaccines? Isn't there an option for using, for example, human challenge trials, which would require fewer people and perhaps in different locations? Dr. Jerome, you can respond and perhaps.
Oh, sure. So, you know, I thought that we were going to move more aggressively with human challenge trials in the very beginning part of this pandemic, when we still don't know what the correct and protective levels of, for instance, antibody are. And we could have derived those from human challenge studies that would have informed hypotheses that could have been tested in the phase 3 trials. There was a real reluctance, and the, you know, several groups wrote opinion pieces on the need to do human challenge studies. And there were tens of thousands of volunteers who signed up to do these. And the reluctance came from, you know, multiple different sources. There were some ethicists who were concerned that, you know, we didn't actually have, you know, if something bad happened, at that point we had maybe remdesivir, but not a lot else that would be able to treat someone. And we made the argument that we would do the testing in young volunteers who are at very, very low risk of bad outcomes. And we just couldn't generate the kind of momentum behind human challenge studies. Now, we're still at the point where we do have some a suggestion that, for instance, monoclonal antibodies given relatively early in the course may actually prevent disease. So maybe we have a stronger argument now for the use of these human challenge models, not only in proving that vaccines work, but in also helping us to understand what the level of protective immunity is when a person becomes susceptible to reinfection. So take a person who had COVID 9 months ago and has a neutralizing antibody level of a certain titer, and challenge them. And if they're protected, then we know that when you're at that level that you don't need to be boosted. So again, I think there's still room for work in human challenge models, and particularly not only for vaccines or for monoclonal antibodies, but for other therapeutics as well. So again, I think there's still a need, and I hope as we develop more and more effective therapeutics, there's actually we're going to overcome some of the resistance that was seen initially.
Unless anybody else has some final words, I think we'll wrap up there. Just want to thank the panelists and sort of reiterate, I think where I started anyway, that we've got all of these different kinds of institutions, all of which are really alternatives, I think, to the strict pharmaceutical companies that have been doing most of the, or a lot of the development of the vaccines that have been approved, at least in the United States and Europe. And I think that perhaps one solution going forward, or one way to think about going forward, is bringing together more of these different kinds of institutions that have these different kinds of resources to offer at different places. Again, that might move us past the strict sort of pharmaceutical investments that have happened so far. So once again, thank you all. We'll circulate a link to the YouTube, to the video that'll be posted on YouTube in a few days. And once again, thank the panelists for joining us, and thank all of the attendees for coming.
Thank you.